He said it so calmly that for a moment I wondered if my ears had played a trick on me. My dad stood beneath the lights in his charcoal suit, holding the microphone he had ripped from the officiant, and told me in front of 180 guests that he wished I had never been born. Not that he was disappointed, not that he disagreed with my choices. He wished I did not exist at all. The sentence sliced through the ballroom like a blast of winter air. Conversation stopped mid-breath. Forks froze in midair. Even the music fell away, as if refusing to witness what came next. I always thought the worst he could say to me would involve disappointment or some lecture about loyalty. Nothing prepared me for erasure, and he did not stop there. He turned to Miles, my husband of barely 13 minutes, and asked how anyone could take our marriage seriously when I had chosen, in his words, a cheap HVAC technician. The insult was so blunt, it stunned the room into a harder silence. People stared. Someone gasped. A woman near the back put a hand to her chest. Miles stood beside me, unflinching, calm in a way that made my dad's tantrum look even smaller. His restraint came from a lifetime of knowing when a man is not worth arguing with. My dad believed he had reduced him to something forgettable. What he did not know was that Miles had more legal training, more influence, and more dignity than anyone at my dad's table of business partners. He simply chose to live without announcing it. My dad scanned the room as if expecting applause. Instead, the silence thickened. I stepped forward because standing still felt like participating. My dress brushed my ankles as I approached him. He held the microphone slightly out of reach, then tightened his grip, as if remembering he owned it, and by extension, owned me. After a beat, he released it. The speakers picked up the sound of my breath. It surprised me how steady I sounded. No trembling, no crack. I thought humiliation would make my voice shake, but instead it landed flat and clear. I told him we were no longer family. 4 words spoken like closing a door already hanging off its hinges. A woman in the second row covered her mouth. A waiter froze mid-stride. My mom dropped her gaze to her lap as if she could hide inside her hands. She did not say a word. She never did in moments like this. I handed the microphone to the officiant, who looked grateful to be free from all of it, then turned toward Linda. She held my eyes for a second, searching for confirmation. I nodded once. She lifted her radio and began directing staff with practiced calm. Meanwhile, I walked off the stage and stood beside Miles again. The warmth of him felt like a small shelter. People whispered. Some stared at me with sympathy. Others glanced at my dad with a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. A few looked toward the exit, unsure whether social etiquette required them to stay in this wreckage of a wedding or quietly escape it. The ballroom at the Harborview Pavilion had never felt so large or so cold. All the linens and candles and flowers looked suddenly theatrical, like props for a play that had changed scripts without warning. A former employee of my dad's, seated near the front, looked away the moment my dad's eyes landed on him. Loyalty evaporates quickly when truth enters the room. My dad stood alone now, the confidence draining from his shoulders. He scanned the room for someone to support him, maybe a board member or business partner. No one moved. No one defended him. Even my mom stayed rooted to her chair. Grief washed through me like warm water. Not happiness, relief. As if something I had carried for years had finally stopped pretending to be manageable. Linda returned quietly. She asked in a low voice whether I wanted her to proceed. I said yes. She did not ask for details. The venue contract was explicit about disorderly conduct and emotional harm to the couple. Her efficiency made the moment feel almost procedural, as if removing a volatile parent from a wedding was simply an item on her checklist. I reached for my phone. I remember the weight of it, cool and familiar. I made one call. Calm, necessary. A call that existed long before this night, in the quiet spaces of my month. Disappointment. I walked a few steps toward the side windows where the sound of the water softened the edges of the chaos behind me. I did not look at my dad while the call connected. I did not need to. When I ended the call, the air in the room shifted. Not dramatically, more like the pressure drop before a storm. My dad noticed it first. He kept glancing toward the entrance, then at me, then at Miles, searching for understanding he had never earned. He took a step toward me, calling my name. Not booming, not commanding, smaller than I had ever heard it. I did not step back. Miles placed his hand lightly on my back, grounding me in quiet solidarity. Guests watched with fascinated discomfort. Some whispered that they had never seen a bride look so composed after such humiliation. Another said maybe it was not composure. Maybe it was a certainty. My mom rose halfway, hesitated, then sat back down when my dad shot her a warning look. The movement was so small, but it settled something in me. Whatever bridge once existed between us had been charred by repetition long before tonight. Staff moved through the room with soft urgency. Glasses were cleared, doors were closed. The DJ muted the music entirely. My dad's breathing grew louder the quieter the room became. Tension wrapped around us like a plastic film. Linda returned and stood at my side. She told me everything was in motion. Her tone was calm, almost gentle. I told her I was fine. I was. In that strange, suspended way a person can be fine right before stepping into a new version of their life. My dad called my name again. A single word. It hung there, thin and futile. He stepped closer, waiting for something. An apology. An opening. Permission to reclaim control. I gave him nothing. Then the double doors at the end of the ballroom opened. The shift was unmistakable. Heads turned. The room held its breath. The color drained from my dad's face as uniformed security stepped inside. Following by two calm, professional investigators, the venue had been contractually permitted to summon when a guest's behavior became threatening. It was the first time in my life I had ever seen him look afraid. And that is where the chapter ends. At the exact moment everyone realized the night was not done with us. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and whatever small conversations had been trying to restart died instantly. Guests straightened in their chairs. A few rose halfway before thinking better of it. My dad froze, eyes darting around as if the room had suddenly become a courtroom he did not prepare for. He had always been good at reading an audience. This time, the audience was reading him. Two venue staff members entered first, calm and deliberate. The kind of calm that unsettles people more than shouting ever could. The guests sensed something had shifted. It made the silence inside the Harborview Pavilion feel heavier, as if the entire evening was holding its breath. My dad kept glancing at the exit, expecting a familiar ally to appear and save him from the humiliation he had created. None did. People instinctively began stepping away from him, creating a wide perimeter like you might around a streetlight about to short out. His isolation grew by the second. Linda, the coordinator, walked toward me with her clipboard held close, moving with quiet authority. When she reached me, she spoke in the softest whisper. Everything is moving according to plan. Security is here. They will step in if he does anything else. I nodded. My dad saw the exchange and stiffened. He started toward me, his steps tight, controlled. The way a man walks when he is trying to preserve dignity he no longer has. He said my name. Not loudly, almost pleading. Watching him shrink without anyone touching him was something I never expected to witness. It was like watching a structure collapse from within. When I did not respond, he looked at Miles, maybe hoping intimidation would land better there. It did not. Miles stood steady, shoulders relaxed, face neutral. He did not need to defend himself. He did not need to defend me. His presence alone was enough. Guest whispers began rippling lightly through the room. People leaned toward one another cautiously, the way you do when you do not want to be caught witnessing a truth you have always suspected. Some recognized the pattern of my dad's temper. Some had worked under him. Some had walked away years ago. Tonight, the mask had slipped publicly, and no one knew where to look. At one table, a former employee of his lowered his gaze when my dad looked his way. Loyalty had evaporated. Fear, too. My dad stood alone with nothing to hide behind but his own echo. My mom still sat stiffly in her chair, hands folded like she was bracing for impact. She met my eyes, and for a moment I saw something like regret there. Then my dad shot her a sharp look, and she went still. I felt a familiar ache, the kind that comes from realizing someone you love is both victim and participant in the same cycle. The officiant looked completely lost. He turned his notes over as if a script for this moment might magically appear. I stepped toward him and told him softly that we were finishing the ceremony. This part still belonged to us. Relief washed over his face. He gathered his notes and asked us to join him. A few guests exhaled, grateful for something normal. Miles extended his hand to me. I took it. Choosing him in that moment did not feel like rebellion. It felt like clarity. We stood facing each other while the officiant cleared his throat and guided us back into the ceremony. His voice steadied as he went. The words felt different now, sharper, honest, sacred in the way truth becomes sacred when it refuses to move for anyone. Behind us, guests tried to compose themselves, adjusting dresses, wiping their eyes, straightening ties, anything to feel normal again. My dad hovered near the aisle like a shadow, unsure where to fall. Every few seconds he shifted his weight, his tension growing in small increments. He was not used to being ignored. When the officiant reached the classic question asking whether anyone objected, a few guests tensed. My dad opened his mouth. Then I closed it. Even he understood another outburst would cost him more than he could recover. That silence was the first real boundary I ever watched him obey. We moved on to vows. Miles went first, speaking in that quiet, steady tone he used when explaining something meaningful. His voice did not need volume to carry weight. It just needed honesty. I listened and felt something anchor inside me. When it was my turn, I expected my voice to shake. It did not. I spoke clearly, surprising myself with how natural it felt to claim my own life in front of people who had once expected me to live someone else's plan. We exchanged rings, simple, almost weightless bands that still felt heavier than anything either of us had worn before. When the officiant pronounced us married, applause rose slowly, then grew warmer. Some stood. Some cried. Some looked at me like they had witnessed a woman step into her own skin. My dad did not clap. His hands stayed rigid at his sides. His eyes were pale with anger or fear or both. He understood, finally, that too many witnesses meant he could not rewrite this memory later. After the applause faded, Linda reappeared. She asked whether I wanted my dad escorted out now or after the first dance. She spoke gently, as if she were asking about appetizers instead of family ruptures. I told her I needed a few minutes. She nodded with professional compassion and stepped away. Guests drifted into the reception area. A few approached me carefully. A woman squeezed my arm and whispered that I looked stronger than she had ever felt on her own wedding day. A former project manager of my dad's gave me a somber look before walking on, his silence saying more than words ever could. People had stopped avoiding the truth. They were studying it, studying him. His unraveling had become visible in a way that could not be undone. Silence had turned into a mirror. I stayed near the edge of the ballroom with Miles. Music began playing again, low and instrumental, though it did nothing to settle my dad. He kept glancing around as if expecting someone to tell him what to do next. His world had operated on scripts. This moment had none. My mom approached us slowly. She looked first at Miles, then at me. Her voice shook when she asked if I was all right. I told her yes. I did not elaborate. Some truths are too large to fit into small exchanges. She stepped back, unsure whether she was allowed to stay near me or supposed to return to my dad. She chose distance. That, too, told a story. Linda appeared one last time to confirm that security was in position. Her calmness kept me grounded. I thanked her. She gave me a soft smile and walked away. The ballroom grew quieter as more guests moved to the reception. The soft hum of the music filled the remaining space. My dad stood alone near the stage, hands clenched, suit crooked, eyes restless. Every part of him looked smaller than it had an hour earlier. Standing beside Miles, I realized this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. Silence had done what words could not. It had laid everything bare. And in that suspended quiet of the Harbor View Pavilion, I finally understood that what came next would reshape all of us. 15 minutes is not a long time, but inside that ballroom it stretched like an entire season turning. Guests sat stiffly, barely breathing, pretending to study their napkins or the centerpieces rather than look directly at the man who had detonated the evening. My dad stood near the stage as if staying close to the microphone might somehow reverse what he had done. It was the posture of someone trying to claw back control simply by proximity. Miles and I stood near the tall windows overlooking the harbor, letting the silence settle around us, like settling ash. Through the glass, I could see reflections of the guests watching my dad out of the corners of their eyes, minds already connecting patterns they had ignored for years. Public cruelty untangles private memories fast. Once a truth is spoken out loud, people begin reinterpreting every past moment that suddenly makes it uncomfortable sense. The doors opened again. Quiet. Controlled. 2 uniformed security officers entered first, moving with calm, trained precision. Behind them was a man in a navy jacket with a small badge clipped near his chest. He carried no handcuffs, no clipboard, nothing that signaled a scene. His presence alone shifted the temperature in the room. My dad recognized it instantly. His back stiffened. His chin rose the way it always did in boardrooms when his authority was questioned. But his eyes betrayed him. They flicked to the exits, then to me, then to the investigator, calculating scenarios he had never imagined would include his daughter's wedding. One of the security officers approached him and addressed him formally. She informed him that due to a violation of the venue's disturbance policy, he needed to step aside for a brief conversation. My dad let out a brittle half-laugh meant to project confidence, though it cracked at the end. He looked around for support. No one moved. His guests suddenly found their water glasses and shoes very interesting. The investigator stepped forward next, introducing himself with calm professionalism. He explained that he was nearby on another assignment and notified of a concerning escalation. He did not mention the call I made. He did not need to. Everything about his demeanor said this was procedure, not emotion. My dad insisted this was a wedding, not a job site, and that someone must have exaggerated. The investigator nodded politely, acknowledging the words without accepting them, then asked him to step outside to determine whether additional action was required to ensure guest safety. My dad's jaw twitched. He looked at me again, searching for an ally, for the daughter he expected to fall into line and soothe the crisis he created. He took a step toward me. He spoke my name in a tone that tried to be authoritative but landed as something closer to begging. He said we could talk about this, that I did not have to do this, that he was still my dad. The word dad trembled at the edges. I did not answer. Silence was the cleanest truth I had left. Security moved closer. The investigator gestured toward the exit. My dad muttered that he did not want a scene. The irony hovered in the air. The scene was already complete. He had performed it himself. When they guided him toward the doors, the ballroom parted like water around a sinking object. People did not look directly at him, but every face shifted in his direction. Even those who had been pretending earlier could not ignore the unraveling now. My mom rose halfway, then sat again when my dad gave a sharp shake of his head. She folded her hands and twisted her wedding ring once, twice, 3 times. My dad paused at the threshold, waiting for someone to stand up for him. No one did. Guests looked away or stared with quiet recognition, the kind that comes when the truth finally catches up to someone who has outrun it for years. Then he stepped through the doorway. The doors closed behind him with a soft thud that felt more final than anything either of us had ever said. For several seconds, the room stayed frozen. A few guests shifted in their seats. Someone near the back wiped their eyes. A man whispered that he had suspected something like this for years. Another said, maybe this was the only way it could have gone. Miles touched my elbow lightly, not asking if I was okay, not trying to fix anything, just reminding me I was not alone. I looked at the closed doors. I expected anger or triumph or something loud. Instead, I felt a quiet emptiness, like a weight had been removed, and my body had not yet learned how to stand without it. The officiant approached us cautiously. His voice shook slightly as he asked whether we wanted to resume the reception program. I told him we would, just not yet. I needed a moment to absorb the shape of what had just shifted inside me. Guests began talking again, softly, cautiously, as if unwilling to disturb whatever fragile peace had settled over the room. Their conversations drifted like distant radio static. None of it mattered. I walked toward the windows and looked out at the harbor. The water was dark and still, reflecting the city lights in jagged lines. Music returned through the speakers, a low instrumental piece that served as a gentle boundary, something to fill the space where screaming or chaos might have lived in another family. Behind me, the ballroom gradually restitched itself. People picked up glasses, straightened napkins, and attempted casual conversation. A few approached Miles with small gestures of support. Someone offered me water. Someone else apologized for what they had witnessed. Their kindness felt soft and unfamiliar. I glanced again at the doors where my dad had disappeared. For the first time in my life, I did not feel the instinct to follow him, to clean up the ruins, to apologize for something I did not do. That instinct had lived inside me for decades, trained by expectations and fear and habit. But tonight, it fell away cleanly. I waited for relief. Instead, a faint echo settled in my chest. Not sorrow, not anger, just finality. A recognition that some endings do not arrive with explosions. They arrive with a simple, irreversible closing of a door. I stayed there, facing the window, taking a quiet breath, letting the air shift around me. The night was not finished. The consequences had not even begun to unfold. But in that stillness between shock and aftermath, I understood that something fundamental had ended. Some doors do not close with noise. They close with silence. I remember being a child in our house on Lakeview Drive in Seattle, a place people admired for its clean lines and expensive art. Visitors used to comment on how peaceful it felt inside. I could never tell if they truly believed that or if they were just responding to the quiet. In our home, quiet was a requirement, not a natural state. My dad used to tell me that feelings were distractions from purpose. I was 12 when he said it the first time. He had returned from a meeting with investors, still wearing the expression he saved for moments when he wanted to shape them. Mood of the household. He told me that family comes before feelings. At the time, I did not understand that what he meant was his definition of family and his definition of purpose came before everything else. Mom floated around him like someone trying to keep a delicate vase from tipping, adjusting schedules, rewriting history in small ways to keep his temper contained. She meant well, I think. Survival can disguise itself as devotion if you live inside it long enough. I learned early that silence was safer than truth, and cooperation was safer than curiosity. When you grow up in a house where control is treated like oxygen, you learn to breathe shallowly. The first time he talked to me about my future, really talked to me, I was 16. He came into my room without knocking, sat on the edge of my desk, and began describing what he called the natural progression of a well-structured life. He listed college options in a tone that made it clear the choices were curated rather than chosen. He described internships at his company the same way someone might describe summer camps. Then, with the same calmness he used in boardrooms, he mentioned the type of man he expected me to marry. A man with ambition. A man connected. A man who understood legacy. I remember asking him if I could decide that later. He smiled, but it was the kind that does not reach the eyes. He told me decisions made early prevent chaos later. He asked me why I would want chaos. At 16, chaos was not something I feared. It sounded a lot like freedom, but I nodded, because nodding kept the temperature in the house stable. Looking back, I can map every step he took to shape me into something that made sense for his story. Introductions to certain families, subtle critiques of any friends he considered too aimless or too emotional, comments delivered casually about the importance of alliances, as if I were being prepped for a diplomatic role rather than a life. He bent the air around me carefully, consistently, until I learned to move in the direction he preferred, without questioning why. He acted as if my adulthood were a corporate succession plan. It never occurred to him that I might want to build something separate, something that did not orbit his vision. Whenever I hinted at interests outside of his blueprint, he would bring up sacrifice, responsibility, family duty. He said those words the way other fathers said pride or encouragement. Then came the conversations about the right man. I was 23 the first time he mentioned Victor by name. He said Victor had discipline. He said Victor understood structure. He said Victor knew how to uphold a standard. What he did not say, but what I learned later, was that Victor also understood how to be loyal to the man who had built them, company he hoped one day to help lead. I tried to push back. Not loudly, not rebelliously. I suggested that maybe I wanted to choose a partner based on compatibility rather than strategy. My dad did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He reminded me of everything he had provided: schools, opportunities, a life without chaos. He suggested that gratitude and alignment were similar values. I remember sitting in that conversation feeling like I was being drafted into a role without having seen the script. Mom never contradicted him. She would sit quietly in the next room, pretending to read or fold laundry, her eyes drifting toward us every few minutes. She never stepped into the doorway. She never said, "Let her decide for herself." I do not blame her entirely. Years of living with a man who treats emotions like liabilities rewires your instincts. She learned to survive by shrinking her opinions until they were small enough to be overlooked. By the time I reached my late 20s, the pressure from him had become a steady ache. He asked about Victor regularly. He treated any disinterest on my part as temporary confusion. He once told me that people who do not know what they want often sabotage themselves by choosing passion over stability. I asked him quietly if he had ever chosen passion for anything. He pretended not to hear me. When I finally met Miles, it was almost accidental. A broken air conditioner at the nonprofit. A repair appointment. A conversation that started over humming vents and ended in a type of ease I had never experienced with a man. My dad would have hated everything about that first meeting. The lack of strategy. The lack of pedigree. The lack of control. He saw my relationship with Miles as a threat long before he ever met him. He could sense someone else becoming important to me, someone outside the world he curated. He asked pointed questions about Miles even when I kept the details vague. He said things like, "Be careful not to confuse comfort with compatibility." He meant, "Do not stray from my plan." By the time my wedding day arrived, my dad had built a version of my life in his mind, so detailed he could not imagine anything outside it. And when I stepped off the path he paved, he saw it as defiance rather than independence. His outburst at the wedding was not new. It was just the first time he had done it publicly. The first time he realized the audience watching him could not be managed with a firm tone or a strategic pause. As I stood by the window that night, the silence thick around me, it became painfully clear that what happened in that ballroom had begun decades before. Every expectation, every correction, every moment where my choices were treated like errors in judgment, they all led to that stage where he revealed, without hesitation, that my existence held meaning only if it served him. I had spent years trying to be a daughter he could respect, but respect had never been the goal. Compliance was. The realization settled into my chest with a strange calmness. Not grief, not rage, just clarity. The kind that arrives when you finally step far enough away to see the shape of something that once felt too close to understand. Victor Hale entered my life long before our first handshake. He existed first as an idea, a possibility my dad began shaping when I was barely old enough to vote. At the time, I did not notice the pattern. I only recognized it years later, the way you notice the shadow in an old photograph you never examined closely. Victor was the chief operating officer of my dad's development company, younger by roughly 20 years. Ambitious in that polished corporate way men adopt when they have been told. Their whole lives they were destined for corner offices. He had a clean reputation, a meticulously pressed wardrobe, and a style of speaking that made every sentence sound pre-approved. My dad admired him from the beginning. They shared a worldview built on structure, hierarchy, and the belief that discomfort is something to be stepped over, not addressed. I met Victor at a holiday event in downtown Seattle, a room full of pine scent and forced camaraderie. He approached me with a smile that looked practiced, asked polite questions about my nonprofit work, and then pivoted seamlessly to what he called my long-term vision. It felt less like conversation and more like evaluation, not flirtation, assessment. Later that night, my dad asked what I thought of him. His tone was casual in the way only intentional tones can pretend to be. I said Victor seemed polite. My dad smiled like that answer confirmed something he had already decided. He talked about Victor's leadership potential, his discipline, his family values, a phrase my dad used when he meant shared power structures rather than emotional grounding. I did not realize he was introducing a plan. I thought he was bragging about his employee. Over the next year, Victor's name surfaced more frequently. My dad mentioned him during dinners, during car rides, during conversations that had nothing to do with the company. He praised his loyalty, his decisiveness, and his composure. He never used the word husband, but the subtext hung between us like humidity. I tried subtle resistance. I joked about not being ready to date. I said I was focused on my work. Once, I even told him gently that I should meet someone on my own terms. He dismissed these comments with a patient smile, the kind men use when they think time is on their side. When I was 26, he invited me to dinner at a waterfront restaurant, supposedly a quiet family night. When I arrived, Victor was seated beside him. My mom gave me a strained smile that translated to behavior. Victor stood to greet me. The conversation that night was surface level, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Questions about my leadership style, my preferred work environment, my long-term personal goals. It was a compatibility interview disguised as dinner. Afterward, my dad walked me to my car. He said he thought the evening had gone well. I said I would have liked to know Victor would be joining us. He waved off my concern. He said spontaneity builds character. I said nothing. My silence annoyed him. I saw it in the tightening of his jaw. Weeks later, he asked whether I would accompany Victor to a charity gala. He called it a networking opportunity. I told him no. He asked why. I told him I was not interested in Victor romantically. He said interest grows with aligned purpose. I said purpose cannot replace affection. That conversation marked the first time he accused me of being ungrateful. He said he had built too much for me to throw away stability for impulsive feelings. At the time, I was still conditioned to interpret his criticism as truth. Hearing him call me impulsive felt like a personal failure, not a manipulation. I avoided Victor when possible. He emailed to suggest coffee to discuss collaboration between the nonprofit and the company. I declined. When he approached me at industry events, I kept conversations brief. He was never rude, but he felt transactional, as though he saw me as a strategic asset rather than a person. The breaking point came the following year, when my mom invited me over on a Saturday morning. She said she wanted to bake together, a disarming gesture she used when tension grew too thick in the house. My dad entered the kitchen carrying a folder. My stomach dropped. He only brought folders into domestic spaces when he wanted to formalize something. He slid the folder toward me. Inside were photos from company events, all featuring Victor beside him, and a printed article about succession planning in corporate families. He said this was the direction that made sense for everyone. He spoke like a man presenting quarterly projections. He said aligning myself with someone like Victor would ensure stability for the company and for the family. I closed the folder. I told him no. No hedging, no softening, just no. He blinked, not accustomed to direct refusal. He asked what I meant. I told him my life was not a merger. I was not a strategic asset. A thin crack appeared in his composure. He said I was making a mistake. I said agreeing would be the mistake. He said I was choosing chaos. I said I was choosing autonomy. His voice sharpened, the way it always did when control slipped from his hands. He said my refusal was a betrayal of the family. The word betrayal stunned me, not because of its severity, but because of its absurdity. He framed my independence as sabotage. He framed my boundaries as disloyalty. He framed his plan as an obligation. My mom watched from the sink, hands gripping the counter, eyes lowered. She never defended me. She never contradicted him. Her silence was its own answer. I left the house that day with a clarity that felt both painful and liberating. For the first time, I understood that my dad did not see me as a daughter with agency. He saw me as an extension of his corporate legacy. My refusal had not disappointed him. It had threatened him. And somewhere between closing his front door and reaching my car, I realized something else. In his worldview, love was conditional. Affection was a resource to allocate. Marriage was a tool. Emotional autonomy was rebellion. And rebellion, to a man built entirely on control, was unforgivable. That understanding stayed with me like a quiet shadow. It taught me something about what my dad feared most. Not my mistakes, not my independence. He feared the day I would choose someone for myself, someone like Miles. By the time my wedding day arrived, my dad was already primed for destruction. A man who believes his daughter's heart endangers his empire is capable of anything. And on that stage, in front of 180 guests, he proved it. Because in his mind, my love was not a choice. It was defiance. I met Miles on a Tuesday afternoon in late July, the kind of Seattle day where the sky cannot decide whether it wants to rain or shine. The air conditioning in our nonprofit's office had given up sometime that morning, and by 2 in the afternoon, the temperature inside had climbed high enough that one of our volunteers fainted during a client intake session. I called the first repair service with availability, expecting a rushed technician who would shrug and tell me to replace the entire system. Instead, 30 minutes later, a man walked through the door carrying a toolbox with one hand and a soft iced coffee in the other, as if he had all the time in the world. He introduced himself politely, simply, with none of the bravado I had come to associate with men who worked inside my dad's orbit. His name was Miles Carter. He was tall, quiet, clean-shaven, dressed in a gray shirt and jeans, the kind of jeans people wear when they actually work in them, not when they want to look like they might. His voice was low and steady, the kind that made you focus without realizing you were doing it. He walked to the broken unit without asking for small talk. He crouched, opened the panel, and examined the wiring with the attention of someone who respected them. Problem, rather than rushing to the solution. After a few minutes, he looked over his shoulder and said calmly that the capacitor had blown, and the entire system needed maintenance. He explained it clearly, in plain English, not with jargon meant to intimidate or confuse. I thanked him for coming so quickly. He said it was nothing. He worked with small community organizations all the time. I remember thinking that his humility felt unfamiliar. Not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. While he worked, I returned to my desk and completed paperwork, but I found myself glancing up occasionally. He moved with a quiet confidence, focused, but not hurried, careful, but not tentative. When the repairs were finished, he wiped his hands with a rag, closed his toolbox, and told me the cool air should return within a few minutes. I paid the invoice, thanked him again, and assumed that was the end of it. It was not. He returned 2 days later, unannounced but not intrusive. He wanted to check if the system was running smoothly. He said some older units took time to stabilize. I told him everything worked perfectly. He nodded, ready to leave, but paused to ask about our work. I explained what we did, how we advocated for workers, how we assisted immigrant families navigating complicated employment or safety issues. He listened with the kind of attention that made the words feel heavier, more grounded. Then he surprised me. He asked if we ever needed legal guidance for labor violation cases. I told him but attorneys were expensive and often unavailable on short notice. He said he understood and left it there. He did not offer help. He did not boast about experience. He did not try to make himself sound indispensable. A week later, he brought us an informational packet he had put together on his own time. It was a step-by-step guide for filing workplace safety complaints, complete with contact numbers, flowcharts, and precise instructions. I stared at the cover sheet for a long time. He was not a technician at all. Or rather, he was, but that was not the full story. We did not start dating immediately. Our conversations evolved gradually, from repair updates to discussions about legal policy to sharing occasional lunches when our schedules overlapped. It was during one of those lunches that he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he held a law degree and had worked in immigration and labor law for several years. He said he took HVAC contracts because they offered steady income and allowed him to control his hours. He liked practical work. He liked solving mechanical problems. And he liked helping people without needing a courtroom to do it. I remember blinking at him, trying to reconcile the quiet man across from me with the image my dad had drilled into me about what success looked like. My dad believed in visible accomplishment. Titles, corner offices, wealth that showed itself on wrists and in driveways. But here sat a man who carried extraordinary knowledge and never once wielded it as a weapon or a badge. He had nothing to prove. It was disarming in the best possible way. On our third unofficial date, he helped an elderly woman load groceries into her car without being asked. On our fourth, he fixed a loose handrail outside our office because he had noticed a volunteer trip earlier that week. On our fifth, he brought coffee for a young man who had come to our nonprofit seeking help after being fired without explanation. Miles listened to the man's story, then offered guidance quietly, professionally, without ever mentioning that he was qualified to represent him in court if necessary. The young man thanked him like he was a stranger who had shown kindness. Miles accepted the gratitude without hinting that he had done more. I realized I had fallen in love with him not in a singular moment, but in a slow collection of moments. All small, all steady, all profoundly different from every expectation my dad had tried to impose on me. When I finally told my dad about Miles, I softened the details on purpose. I said he worked with HVAC systems. I said he was good at what he did. I said he was kind. I did not mention law school. I did not mention his expertise. I did not mention the way he cared about people in a way that made even the most hopeless situations feel survivable. I knew my dad would weaponize those details, twisting them into something strategic or dismissive. My dad's reaction was predictable. He asked how serious it was. He asked if Miles came from a family with influence. He asked if his job promised upward mobility. When I said he worked in skilled trades and seemed perfectly content, my dad made a sound that barely qualified as a laugh. He said it was a phase. He said comfort can be seductive for young women who do not understand the long-term consequences of choosing sentiment over structure. What he never asked was whether I loved him. During one argument, my dad said I was making decisions based on emotion rather than reason. I nearly told him the truth then, that the most reasonable choice I had ever made was choosing someone who valued people more than power. But I held my tongue, not out of fear, out of understanding. He was incapable of absorbing that truth without twisting it into something else. The irony of his insult at our wedding, calling Miles a cheap HVAC technician in front of 180 guests, is that he had built that insult on incomplete information. He had misjudged the man entirely. He saw only the surface and mistook it for the whole structure. It was the same mistake he made with me for most of my life. Miles had told me early on that he did not need to prove himself to anyone. He said titles did not interest him. He said prestige was a fragile thing to build a life on. He preferred work where results could be seen, touched, measured. That confidence was not arrogance. It was internal, private, built over years of choosing substance over appearance. My dad never understood men like that. They unsettled him. A person who cannot be impressed is a person who cannot be controlled. The night he publicly mocked Miles was the night he revealed more about himself than about my husband. He showed the world he valued perception more than truth, that he equated worth with wealth, character with title, power with dignity. He believed humiliation would diminish Miles. What he did not understand was that Miles had already anchored his worth in places my dad could not reach. Standing in that ballroom, watching my dad unravel, I realized that the man he despised most was not the man I married. It was the version of me who chose him. My dad had built the wrong story in his mind. He thought he knew the roles. He thought he knew the actors. He thought he had cast the leading man in my life years before, and that all I had to do was deliver the lines. He never bothered to learn the real character arcs. He never studied the true narrative. If he had, he might have recognized his error before it became irreversible. He never knew Miles was an attorney. He never knew how deeply he understood labor law, how carefully he advocated for vulnerable workers, how strategically he analyzed systems that exploited people. He never knew the depth of character behind the quiet exterior, the intelligence hidden behind those steady eyes. He never knew who he was talking to that night, and that, more than anything else, was his largest miscalculation. I grew up watching things children are not supposed to understand. Back then, I did not have the vocabulary for any of it, only a restless tightening in my stomach whenever my dad walked through the house with that clipped tone he used when someone had disappointed him. Looking back now, it is unsettling how early a child learns the shape of power long before learning the word for it. I remember sitting on the staircase when I was around 10, pretending to read while listening to him take phone calls in his office. His voice changed depending on who he spoke to. With my mom, he used a patient, coaxing rhythm. With donors, he used warmth, almost charm. But with his workers, especially the ones whose names he mispronounced or whose accents were thick, his voice turned metallic. He told them they were replaceable. He told them loyalty mattered more than excuses. He told them that people who wanted to keep feeding their families needed to remember who signed their checks. He would end each call with a long exhale, shoulders settling back, satisfied, as if restoring control was a sacred duty. The first time I saw him threaten someone in person I was 12. He brought me to a construction site outside Everett, calling it father-daughter time. Instead, I stood 10 feet away while he backed a man into a corner near a half-framed wall. The man tried explaining that half his crew had returned late from visiting family abroad due to visa complications. He said he was short-staffed, doing the best he could. My dad leaned in so close, the man's shoulders pressed into the wood. His voice dropped, low and deliberate. Something about consequences and how immigration problems tended to get bigger when people became uncooperative. The man went pale. He nodded. The conversation ended. On the drive home, I asked why the man had looked scared. My dad told me some people responded only to pressure. He said leadership required knowing which buttons to push. At the time, his explanation sounded polished and wise. Children will believe anything if the person saying it is the one who tucks them in at night. By high school, the edges of the truth were impossible to ignore. I overheard late-night arguments between my parents about safety protocols being skipped, wages being withheld, workers pushed past exhaustion. My mom spoke softly, carefully, as if trying to prevent a glass from shattering. My dad's replies were rigid. He said she did not understand business. He said workers should be grateful. He said regulations were designed by people who had never run a company, and that sometimes bending rules was necessary for the greater good. That phrase, greater good, became the shield he reached for whenever he did not want scrutiny. It took me years to understand that excuses wrapped in idealism are still excuses. When I was 17, I volunteered at a community center near Lake City. What started as a school requirement became something else entirely. Many of the families who came for help were immigrants. Some feared speaking English. Some feared speaking at all. Their stories felt like echoes of the conversations I had overheard at home. Men who had not been paid for weeks. Women threatened when they asked for safer work conditions. Teenagers who said their fathers slept in cars because injuries made them too slow for the job, and they were afraid of being reported. One woman came in clutching a folder with pay stubs and notes written in fading ink. She said her husband's boss had taken his passport for safekeeping and would not return it. She apologized repeatedly, as if fairness were a burden. When I asked where her husband worked, she said the name of a subcontractor I recognized, one my dad used often. The room felt smaller immediately. I did not confront him. I wanted to, but wanting and being able are different things when you are 17 and still trying to reconcile the man who brought home pastries with the man who treated people like liabilities. In college, I studied public policy and labor history. I took courses on immigration law, workplace safety, coercion, exploitation, retaliation. Words for things I had witnessed but never named. Once you have language for something, you cannot pretend you do not see it. During one summer break, I asked my dad whether employers should ever take employee documents. He laughed, said people often lost their passports, and responsible managers provided structure. When I questioned it further, he told me I sounded naive. He said my generation cared too much about feelings. He said order mattered more than idealism. After he left the room, my mom told me gently not to challenge him. She said he only heard defiance. She said he could not tolerate being questioned. She meant it as protection. But her silence also taught me its own lesson. Silence is not neutral. It reinforces the loudest voice in the room, even when that voice is wrong. The nonprofit I founded after graduate school was not a rebellion. It was a response. The stories I heard as a child never left me. They accumulated, layering themselves into something like moral gravity. When I launched our first workers' clinic in a rented room on Rainier Avenue, I thought if I could help even one person avoid fear, then the work was worth doing. My dad pretended to support it initially. He wrote a small check, made light comments about building character, but when he realized my organization processed complaints that sometimes connected back to contractors in his orbit, his tone shifted. He called me meddlesome. He said I did not understand how business operated. He warned me that siding with people who brought trouble on themselves would eventually reflect poorly on me. I told him fairness was not trouble, and silence was not loyalty. He did not hear me. One night stands out sharply. I had referred a worker to legal aid for help reclaiming unpaid wages. The worker had been on a project indirectly tied to my dad's development chain. My dad showed up at my apartment door unannounced. His face held that controlled anger he used when he felt exposed. He said I had humiliated him. He said I had no right to interfere. He said family should align, not divide. I told him alignment meant nothing without principles. It was the first time I spoke to him without cushioning the truth. Something flickered in his expression, but he masked it quickly and left. Despite everything, I kept hoping he would change, that he would wake up one morning and decide to see people instead of categories. That he would hear the fear in people's voices and remember empathy. Children cling to hope even when evidence has given up. Even after I met Miles, even after Miles quietly gathered documentation linking labor violations to subcontractors tied to my dad's projects, I hesitated. Miles told me people do not change without consequences. He said accountability and transformation rarely occur in the same breath. I wanted to believe my dad could be the exception because he was my dad. But weddings have a way of exposing truths with surgical precision. When he stood beneath the chandeliers and told 180 guests that he wished I had never been born, he did more than humiliate me. He clarified everything. It was not anger. It was an ideology. In his mind, I had ceased to be someone he loved the moment I refused to be, someone he controlled. It was not about Miles. It was not about the nonprofit. It was about the fact that I had stopped orbiting him. And to someone who builds their world on power, loss of orbit feels like betrayal. I gave him more than one chance, more than one escape route, more than one opportunity to see himself clearly. But clarity is only useful to people who want to change. And he never did. Miles once told me that accountability is rarely convenient. He said people only change when staying the same becomes more painful than facing the truth. I remember exactly where we were when he said it. My office at the nonprofit. Late afternoon light on the carpet, a stack of case files between us. He had just finished reviewing the complaints from a drywall site north of Tacoma. A cluster of statements describing withheld pay, confiscated documents, and thinly veiled threats. He closed the file, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and said that some men mistake fear for loyalty, but fear always breaks eventually. Someone always names it. When he learned that several of those complaints traced back to subcontractors tied to my dad's development network, he did not push me. He simply said we had options, legal ones, ethical ones, necessary ones. Then he waited. He always waited, which was one of the things I admired about him. He understood the timing. He understood readiness. Justice to him was not a blunt instrument. It was a process. I was not ready then. I told him my dad was complicated. I told him the man in those affidavits could not be reduced to the man who drove me to swim lessons and bought me hot chocolate after school. I said I wanted to talk to him first, that if anyone could make him change his practices, it would be someone he loved. Miles listened, silent, patient. Then he asked one question. What makes you believe he still sees you as his daughter and not as an extension of his power? I had no answer. As the wedding approached, the evidence grew heavier. More workers came forward. Anonymous statements, cautious phone calls, sometimes just a trembling voice on voicemail that disconnected before leaving. A name. Stories of unpaid overtime. Threats disguised as warnings. Visas dangled like leashes. People moved from site to site with no records, no safety protocols, no oversight. Different voices. Same pattern. Late at night, I stared at the ceiling, wondering how much of this I had already known in the quiet corners of childhood. How many conversations I had tried to reinterpret, how many instincts I had smothered in the name of love. Denial can be soft, warm, familiar, the emotional equivalent of a blanket you cling to even when it stops letting you breathe. 2 months before the wedding, Miles and I sat on the living room floor surrounded by binders he had assembled. He walked me through timelines, documents, cross-referencing, and legal standards. It was not chaos. It was structured, a deliberate structure. I closed one binder and told him I needed to speak to my dad privately, not as an attorney, not as a whistleblower, as a daughter. Miles nodded. He said he would support whatever I chose, but he reminded me that time was not infinite. People were being hurt. While I searched for the right moment to talk to my dad, others lived with threats hovering over them like weather systems. For weeks, I rehearsed the conversation in my head. I imagined him listening. I imagined him recognizing harm. I imagined him agreeing to restructure his company, return documents, and stop the intimidation tactics. I imagined accountability without destruction. A solution without fallout. A version of him that had probably never existed. Every time I picked up the phone to arrange dinner, something stopped me. Not fear. Something colder. A growing suspicion that the man I hoped to appeal to was not the man standing in the world, building a kingdom on the backs of people who had no power to refuse him. Still, I held on. Hope is a stubborn thing when you are raised to believe love can outlast evidence. On the wedding morning, I told Miles that if anything went wrong, I wanted to handle my dad myself. He asked why. I told him that if change came because of me, maybe it would finally reach whatever part of my dad still cared. He cupped my face gently and said, offering someone a chance to change is an act of faith, not an obligation. And faith, he said, has limits. I did not expect the limit to arrive so publicly. When my dad stepped up to the microphone, bow tie still perfectly straight, posture sharp with irritation, I felt something inside me brace instinctively. He looked at me, not with confusion or sadness or concern. He looked at me like a failed investment. Then he said he wished I had never been born. The words sliced through the room like they had been waiting their entire life, lives, for their release. He turned on Miles next, mocked him, belittled him, reduced him to the job title he believed defined him. The insult was not about Miles. It was about control. My dad could not understand a world where my marriage had nothing to do with his legacy. The clarity that hit me afterward was almost gentle. All the years of excuses dissolved like mist. The scaffolding of denial collapsed, revealing the truth beneath it. He was not losing control. He was revealing it, revealing who he had always been. When I took the microphone and told him we were no longer family, I was not retaliating. I was stating a fact that had been growing quietly for years. The ballroom faded. The murmurs blurred. My voice remained steady. The truth often is. When security escorted him out, I did not feel anger or triumph. I expected grief, maybe, or panic, or guilt. Instead, I felt release. Clean, quiet release. Like exhaling after holding my breath for decades. When the doors closed behind him, my wedding coordinator approached and asked softly whether I wanted to proceed with the call I had authorized in our contingency plan. It was an ordinary question, delivered gently, but it cut through the fog with precision. For a moment, I saw two paths. One where I continued trying to save a man who had shown no desire to be saved. Another where I stepped entirely out of the cycle. Not for revenge, not for retaliation, but because a person who denies your humanity does not deserve your protection. I thought of the workers who trusted our nonprofit, the man in Everett whose voice had shaken, the woman who clutched the folder of pay stubs, the teenagers who watched their parents crumble under threats. I had spent years protecting someone who used people as leverage. That realization arrived quiet and final. I nodded. Miles came to stand beside me. He did not touch me at first, as if he sensed I needed to stand inside the decision without anchoring myself to anyone else. Then he asked if I was sure. I said yes. He exhaled once, then said he was proud of me. Not because I was acting against my dad, but because I had stopped confusing endurance with love. He handed me my phone. My thumb hovered for a brief second, expecting hesitation, expecting the old instinct to smooth things over, to shield him, to protect him from consequences he had never protected anyone else from. But nothing came. Only clarity. I dialed. The call connected. My voice was level, neutral. I provided the case numbers, the location, the confirmation that the subject was on the premises and agencies had been previously notified. I answered every question as if I were reading from a script, not because I felt detached, but because I no longer felt conflicted. When I hung up, I waited for guilt, for doubt, for the ache of disloyalty. But all I felt was the quiet of someone who had finally stepped out of a storm they had been calling weather their entire life. For the first time, Choosing myself did not feel like betrayal. It felt like the truth. I walked into the small sitting room the venue staff had offered us after the P. Commotion settled, and for a moment I thought the quiet inside might steady me. It did not. The room felt too still, like the air itself was waiting to register what had happened. My mom was already there, sitting on a narrow sofa near the window, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles looked bloodless. She looked up when I entered, and for the first time that night I noticed the faint tremor in her breathing. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, like she was testing each word inside her mind and finding none of them safe. I sat across from her, not beside her. There are distances that grow long before you acknowledge them. She said my name softly. It sounded careful, almost rehearsed. Her eyes flicked toward the closed door, as if someone might overhear a conversation we had not even begun. Finally, she whispered that she was sorry. The apology floated there, thin and incomplete, like a ribbon caught on a branch. Sorry for what? I asked. I was not trying to corner her. I genuinely wanted to know which part she believed she should claim. She looked down at her hands. She said she did not know what she was supposed to do out there. Everything happened so fast. She said she froze. I nodded. It was not untrue, but it was not the whole truth either. Silence is rarely neutral. It bends toward the person with the most power. She said she had wanted to step forward. She said she had felt sick hearing my dad say those words. She said she wished she had found her voice. She said she did not know how to stop him when he was like that. As if that version of him was an occasional visitor instead of the man she had lived beside for years. As if those words were somehow separate from the decades of smaller choices that led to that moment. She spoke the way people speak when they want to soften the edges of reality, to make it survivable. I told her I understood she felt overwhelmed. And I did. But I also told her something else, because the truth had been sitting inside me like a stone. I reminded her that she did not step forward because she was afraid of him, not because she did not understand what he was doing. I reminded her that freezing is not a lack of action. It is a choice that protects someone and leaves someone else exposed. She swallowed hard and said she had always tried to keep peace in the family. That was the phrase she used. Keep peace. I had heard it my entire life. It was her shield. It was her refuge. It was also her trap. I asked her gently how much peace she had really kept. She looked at me with wounded confusion, the way someone does when they realize the story they have told themselves for years no longer matches the story unfolding in front of them. I said that avoiding conflict does not neutralize it. It hides it in corners where children learn to tiptoe and wives learn to speak indirectly, and daughters learn to shrink themselves so the house does not tilt. She said she never meant for me to feel unprotected. She reached out slightly, not fully extending her hand, just a hesitant gesture suspended between us. I did not pull away. But I did not lean forward either. I said the hardest part of the night had not been my dad's words. I said the hardest part had been watching everyone look away, watching 180 faces drop their gaze rather than intervene, watching my mom, the person who knew the most about who he was behind closed doors, remain seated while he told a room full of people that he wished I had never been born. She closed her eyes briefly, as if the sentence itself carried weight. When she opened them again, they looked older. She whispered that she thought things would get better with time, that marriage and stability might soften him. She said she had learned to walk carefully around his temper. She said she thought she was teaching me strength by teaching me endurance. I told her that I had spent many years believing him capable of change, but that belief had cost me more than I realized. I had tried to translate cruelty into discipline, control into protection, ego into leadership. I had convinced myself that if I just spoke to him the right way, chose the right moment, or found the right words, he would see me as more than a bargaining chip. She looked devastated. She asked if that was really how I saw myself in his eyes. I said yes, because that was the truth. He did not want a daughter. He wanted an heir, and when I chose a life that did not align with his blueprint, when I chose Miles, when I chose integrity, when I chose independence, he saw it as betrayal. She whispered that she did not know how to undo any of this. Her voice, people often reach for the idea of undoing when faced with consequences. as if time were a thread they could pull until events unraveled. I told her she did not need to undo anything, but she did need to understand it. I said I loved her, and I did, but I also said love does not survive in silence. Not forever. She wiped at her eyes with the corner of a napkin. She said she had stayed quiet for safety. I asked quietly, whose safety? Mine or hers? She did not answer. I reminded the subject by urging me not to provoke my dad, by telling me I misunderstood his intentions. I reminded her of every time she had framed his control as protection, his temper as passion, his manipulation as stress. Not to blame her, but because naming something is the first step toward dismantling it. She whispered that she thought she was doing what wives do. She said she learned it from her own mother. She said she believed loyalty meant staying beside him no matter what. She looked ashamed when she said it, as if admitting her own learned patterns made her complicit. I told her that loyalty without truth is not loyalty. It is fear dressed up as virtue. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Her breathing steadied slowly. She looked out the window at the parking lot, the lights reflecting on the pavement. When she finally turned back to me, her expression had shifted ever so slightly. Not enough to call it understanding, but enough to call it recognition. Recognition of something she had refused to see before. She said she had lost her daughter tonight. Her voice trembled. She said she did not know how to repair that. I told her she had not lost me, not yet, but she had reached the last moment where silence could be mistaken for innocence. If she wanted a relationship with me going forward, she would need to choose honesty over safety. She would need to stop protecting him at the cost of everyone else. She would need to stop pretending she was powerless. She flinched at the word pretend. I softened my tone and told her I knew fear trains people to minimize themselves. I told her I knew she had lived many years in a house that taught her quiet was the only shield she possessed. I told her I understood that breaking that pattern felt dangerous, but I also told her I had spent years believing she saw me, truly saw me, and if she did, then today should have been the day she stood. Her eyes filled again, but this time the tears did not spill. She held them back with determination I had not seen in her for years. She asked what she needed to do now. The question arrived like a small tremor in the air, the early sign of a shift she had not yet named. I told her she needed to stop pretending she had no power. She needed to decide who she wanted to be before the dust settled around me. Dad's choices. I did not tell her how to feel. I did not tell her whom to support. I told her only that her silence had shaped more than she realized, and that shaping comes with responsibility. She nodded slowly, a hesitant movement, but intentional. She said quietly that she had spent her marriage trying not to make things worse. She said she now understood that avoiding conflict is sometimes the worst choice of all. When she looked at me again, something in her expression had changed. It was not confidence, not yet, but an awareness, a shift in gravity, a first crack in a wall that had stood for decades. She whispered that she was sorry for staying seated, sorry for letting him speak those words without pushing back, sorry for teaching me that quiet was safer. I reached for her hand this time, not out of obligation, out of truth. Her fingers tightened around mine, a small, trembling grip. She asked whether I believed she could be different now. I told her people can change when they finally see themselves clearly. She closed her eyes and breathed in deeply, as if preparing to step into a life she had never fully inhabited. When she opened them again, she said she did not want to repeat her silences. She said she did not want to stand behind him anymore. Her voice was fragile but resolute, the kind of voice a person uses when they first reclaim something they forgot belonged to them. For the first time all night, I felt the faintest shift toward something like possibility. Not forgiveness, not yet, but possibility. She looked toward the door, then back at me, and said she finally understood that silence, too, makes a choice. I held her hand a moment longer, then released it gently. The night was not over. The fallout had barely begun. But in that small room, with its too quiet air, she took her first step out of the shadow she had lived in for so long, and I let her take it. The morning after the wedding felt strangely ordinary at first. The light coming through our bedroom window looked the same as it always had. Soft and gray, with a hint of the Seattle marine layer pressing against them. Glass. For a brief second, I thought maybe the world had not shifted as dramatically as it had. But then my phone buzzed. and the quiet spell broke. Miles was still asleep beside me, his breathing slow and even, the same steady rhythm that had grounded me through the chaos of the night before. I slipped out of bed carefully and walked into the kitchen. I did not open the messages right away. I made coffee instead. The ordinary act of it gave my hands something to do while my mind prepared for what I knew was waiting. The first message came from a colleague at the nonprofit. She asked whether I was all right and said people from the wedding had begun calling her to express concern. The second message came from an old high school friend who had seen a short video clip circulating privately among guests. The third message was from one of my dad's former board assistants. She said the board chair had already requested an emergency meeting for Monday morning. She did not provide details, only that something had cracked open, and there was no way the company could pretend otherwise. I sat down at the table with my mug and let the information settle. The aftershocks were beginning. Not loud ones, not dramatic ones, just the quiet tremors that mark the start of a structural shift. By 9 a.m, Miles joined me in the kitchen, still half asleep, hair tousled, looking at me with a mix of worry and steadiness. He asked if I wanted to talk about anything. I said I needed to go in to the nonprofit. There were intake appointments scheduled and clients waiting. He nodded, kissed my cheek, and said he would handle any inquiries that arrived regarding them. Investigation. His calmness felt like a soft place to land. When I arrived at the office, my assistant froze mid-sentence as soon as she saw me. She hugged me tightly, the kind of hug people give when they do not have language for what happened. She said people from different agencies had called asking about available documentation. She said reporters had emailed requesting comments. I asked her to decline politely. Our work was our work. It did not need to become part of a spectacle. She nodded and handed me a folder of client files for the day. I exhaled, grateful for the routine of purpose. As the morning passed, more information filtered toward me in fragments. A friend forwarded a text from someone who worked at the development firm's headquarters. She said employees walked in to find the atmosphere brittle and tense. She said 2 senior project managers had already removed their names from ongoing bids. She said gossip spread fast that immigration officials had shown up at them wedding. She asked whether it was true. I did not respond. Around lunchtime, a message arrived from one of the workers our nonprofit had assisted months earlier. He said thank you. That was all. 2 words, but they landed with a weight I felt all the way down to my ribs. He did not know what had happened at the wedding. He did not know the personal cost of what had unfolded. All he knew was that something had shifted in the world in a way that made him feel seen. By early afternoon, the local business paper had published a short piece. It was cautious and tightly written, avoiding speculation, but noting that federal investigators had made contact with the leadership team at my dad's firm. The article ended by stating that neither he nor the chief operations officer, Victor Hale, had responded to requests for comment. I stared at the line about Victor longer than I expected to. For years, he had been positioned as the successor, the golden figure my dad believed belonged beside me, the man whose presence was engineered to secure my future inside the company. And now his name appeared in the context of scrutiny rather than stability. Someone sent me a screenshot from a private industry forum. High-level contractors were advising one another to pause pending partnerships until clarity emerged. They did not want to be associated with risk. In that world, reputation is currency. And once it begins to fracture, people scatter to protect themselves. Around 3 p.m, my mom called. I let it ring until voicemail picked up. I could not step back into the emotional debris so soon. Not when I was still working, still breathing through the immediate aftermath, still sorting through what pieces belong to me and what pieces belong to him. By evening, the short business article had been expanded. More sources, more detail, more questions. One paragraph mentioned concerns about document handling on construction sites, referencing patterns similar to documented federal cases. Another paragraph said the board would likely initiate an internal review. A final paragraph mentioned that the chief operations officer was now under inquiry as well, given his proximity to decision-making systems. I was stunned by how quickly the narrative was shifting away from my dad's control. For decades, he had managed perception meticulously. Every headline, every partnership, every public statement. He had built an image brick by brick. Now the structure was creaking. When I got home, Miles was in the living room reading through several emails from legal contacts. Momentum is hard to slow. Multiple agencies coordinate. Information gets cross-referenced. Patterns emerge. He watched my face as he spoke, gauging my reaction. I told him I felt oddly calm. Not relieved, not triumphant, just steady. He nodded and said that steadiness comes when you finally stop carrying. Response: later that night, I received a call from a journalist I had once collaborated with on a labor rights piece. She asked if I would comment on the story developing around my dad's company. I told her I could not speak about anything under investigation. She asked whether I wanted to clarify my role. I said my role had not changed. I continued to run a nonprofit that supported workers. That was the beginning and end of it. She paused, then said she respected that. Before hanging up, she asked one more question. She asked whether I believed accountability should apply equally to all people, regardless of their personal connections. I answered yes. It was the simplest truth I had that day. Over the next few days, the ripple effects widened. A major development partner suspended a joint project worth several $1 million. A safety inspection team showed up at one of my dad's sites without notice. A union representative publicly demanded a full audit. And for the first time in years, people who had once whispered concerns began speaking openly. Not loudly, but plainly, as if they had been waiting a long time for permission to acknowledge them. Cracks. Victor reached out through a terse email. He said he hoped I understood that none of this reflected on him personally. He said he had always supported me. He said he had been caught in the crossfire of misunderstandings. I stared at the message for a long time. The man who had been groomed to become the heir to the empire was already maneuvering to distance himself. Power is never more revealing than when it begins to slip. The board held its emergency meeting early the following week. I did not attend, of course, but someone who had been close to my dad for years sent me a brief summary. They said the board was alarmed by the possibility of federal charges. They said the financial department had been instructed to prepare contingency plans. They said several board members were questioning whether Victor had knowingly ignored compliance issues. They said no one defended my dad's behavior at the wedding. Not publicly, not privately. Silence is a fragile shield. Once it cracks, there is nothing left behind it. In the midst of all of this, I went to work each day. I sat with clients. I reviewed cases. I attended meetings. I walked into the office and hung my coat on the same hook I always had. The world outside was shifting, but my purpose did not. The nonprofit was the one place where I could be useful without navigating layers of political fallout. One afternoon, a colleague asked whether I felt guilty about what was happening to my dad. I surprised myself by answering quickly. I said no. Not because I wanted to see him hurt, but because guilt belongs to those who have acted wrongly. I had not. I had lived honestly. I had made choices grounded in principle. I had tried for years to guide him toward a better path. What happened was the result of his own hand, not mine. A few days later, I received a short message from my mom. 3 sentences. She said things at the house were tense. She said my dad refused to talk about the wedding or the investigation. She said he was angrier than she had ever seen him. I read the message twice without responding. Some storms move toward you. Others pass you by while you watch from a distance you worked hard to build. Toward the end of that week, I learned something that settled into my mind with a familiar heaviness. During a discussion with the board, my dad had been advised to address the situation publicly, to offer an apology for his conduct at the wedding, to take responsibility for the emotional harm he had caused. It would not have reversed the investigation, but it would have signaled integrity to the partners still deciding whether to stand by him. He refused. He said apologizing would make him look weak. He said admitting wrongdoing was worse than committing it. He said he had built his entire career on never backing down, not for anyone. Not for anything. That was his truth. And that was the moment I knew he would never say the words that mattered. Not because he believed he was innocent, but because an apology requires relinquishing power, and he had never learned how to live without it. Losing my dad did not happen in one night, even though the wedding made it look that way. The truth is that loss stretches itself across years, sometimes decades, revealing itself in small fractures before the final break. But after the wedding, after the investigation began, after the board meetings and the headlines, and the silence that settled around, came him like a second skin. The loss became undeniable. It took shape. It became a presence, not an absence. I felt it the same way you feel a shift in the air before a storm. Something had ended, and it was not coming back. In the first few weeks, I kept waiting for a grief I thought was inevitable, the kind of grief that knocks people off their feet and sends them searching for familiar ground. But my grief arrived differently. It came quietly, not as screaming or sobbing, but as a soft ache behind my ribs when I brushed my teeth at night or folded laundry. It showed up in ordinary moments, reminding me that endings do not always roar. Sometimes they whisper. The family I grew up in began to unravel quickly once the illusion of unity fell apart. A cousin I had been close to for years stopped reaching out. She sent one careful message saying she hoped everyone was well, then disappeared into the safe distance of silence. An aunt, my dad's sister, sent a clipped note suggesting I had overreacted and that weddings are emotionally charged environments prone to misunderstanding. She said reputation should be handled delicately. She did not ask how I felt. She did not ask why I made the choices I did. She asked only whether I understood the damage that public humiliation could cause to a man in my dad's position. I read her message twice, closed my phone, and let the relationship end without ceremony. Other relatives remained quiet, choosing neutrality in a situation where neutrality was not actually neutral. It was a choice. Just like my mom's silence at the wedding had been a choice. I learned something then. People often cling to the person who frightens them, not the person who frees them. The first time I saw my mom in person after the wedding was almost 3 weeks later. She looked smaller, as if the conflict had reduced her physically. She hugged me, then stepped back and studied my face like she was looking for evidence of something she could not name. She said the house was quiet. Too quiet. She said my dad barely spoke, barely slept, and spent hours pacing the hallway. She said she did not know how to help him. I reminded her gently that helping someone who does not want to change is not helping. It is surrender. She cried then, not loudly, just tears slipping down one cheek as she admitted she had tied her life to a man who never intended to let anyone steer. She said she felt caught between the version of him she had married and the version of him who emerged in the years that followed. I told her loss is sometimes the toll we pay for leaving a life that was never truly ours. She nodded, wiping her eyes, and said she was beginning to understand the difference between peace and quiet. Quiet hides. Peace heals. After that conversation, I knew our relationship would survive in some form, though not the one it used to be. She was trying. Even trying hurts, but it was a start. Other losses arrived without warning. Friends I had known since childhood sent messages filled with caution, not compassion. One told me she hoped I understood the consequences of challenging someone as influential as my dad. Another said she could not believe I allowed investigators into the wedding, as if the timing had been a choice rather than the logical endpoint of years of misconduct. A third simply said, she hoped my marriage was worth the cost. Questions framed as judgments. Advice framed as warnings. I felt the shape of those messages long after I deleted them. Not because they wounded me deeply, but because they revealed the limits of relationships built on selective vision. One of the hardest losses was with my uncle, my dad's younger brother. He had always been kind to me growing up, teaching me how to build small models from scrap wood, letting me ride with him to the hardware store. When he heard what happened, he asked to meet for coffee. I thought maybe he wanted to understand. Maybe he wanted to offer support. But he spent the entire conversation defending my dad's stress levels, explaining that the pressures of leadership can distort a man's judgment. He said my dad had sacrificed everything for the family and deserved loyalty in return. He said publicly distancing myself from him would haunt me. I listened. I watched his eyes shift whenever he reached a point that contradicted his own morality. When he finished, I told him calmly that loyalty and silence have different consequences, depending on who is harmed by them. He had no reply. We parted politely, but something between us fractured. Distance arrived without either of us naming it. But not all losses were painful. Some were clarifying. I realized how many connections I maintained out of habit rather than genuine trust. People who had drifted into my life because of my last name drifted out with. similar ease. Their absence created space I had not realized I needed. Through all of this, Miles remained steady beside me. He did not try to repair what could not be repaired. He did not try to correct people's perceptions or soothe my discomfort. He simply stood with me, present, without pressure. Some nights we sat on the sofa in silence, both too tired to dissect the day. Other nights he listened while I tried to make sense of the emotional debris. He never said, "I told you so." He never implied I had waited too long to see the truth. That restraint mattered more to me than any declaration of support could have. One evening, a few months after the wedding, I found myself sitting in our bedroom staring at an old family photograph. All of us by the lake in Chelan, smiling, sunburned, arms wrapped around each other after a long day on the water. I studied the picture for a long time. I tried to remember if the happiness had been real, or if it had been a moment captured between storms. Some memories are honest, some are curated. It takes time to learn the difference. I placed the photograph back in the drawer and realized something. Losing my dad did not erase my history. It did not undo the childhood moments that had shaped me, but it did force me to separate the man he was from the father I had wanted him to be. That separation hurt, but the clarity it brought was a strange kind of relief. As the investigation deepened, as the board meetings continued, as partners withdrew and projects stalled, people occasionally asked me if I regretted anything. They asked whether I wished I had handled the wedding differently, whether I wished I had not made the call, whether I wished I had waited longer or tried harder. Each time I thought about it carefully, not emotionally, not defensively, thoughtfully. What I told them was simple. I said losing someone who refuses accountability is not the same as abandoning them. It is accepting the truth of who they are and choosing not to be pulled under by it. The price of that acceptance is steep. It cost me pieces of my extended family. It cost me the illusion that conflict can be avoided without consequence. It cost me the hope that one day my dad might see me not through the lens of his ambition, but through the lens of love. But peace is not free. It asks for payment. Sometimes in the form of letting go, sometimes in the form of being misunderstood, sometimes in the form of standing alone long enough to learn that solitude is, not always, emptiness. Sometimes it costs the life you lived so you can build the life you deserve. What I lost mattered, but what I gained mattered more. And by the time the dust began to settle, I finally understood something I had been circling for years. Peace is not a prize. It is a responsibility, and I was ready to carry it, whatever it cost. I chose my life on a quiet afternoon in early spring, months after the wedding, months after the investigation had carved its way through the polished image my dad had built for so many years. It happened without ceremony, no dramatic confrontation, no final argument. I simply woke up one morning in our small house in the Finney Ridge neighborhood, listened to the sound of Miles making coffee downstairs, and realized that something inside me had settled into place. Peace does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives like that. Soft, unassuming, ordinary. By then, the company that had once defined my dad's identity was a different landscape, entirely. Several projects had been frozen pending regulatory review. The board had removed him from day-to-day oversight while outside compliance. Teams conducted interviews. Meetings he used to dominate now occurred without him. Invitations he once received reflexively stopped arriving. Silence replaced the influence that had once shielded him. I did not follow every detail closely. I learned quickly that freedom meant stepping out of the orbit of his choices, not tracking their consequences. Occasionally, someone forwarded an article or mentioned a development in but the information no longer attached itself to my ribs the way it used to. It drifted through my awareness like background radio static, present but no longer shaping me. The nonprofit became my anchor in that season. The office near Rainier Avenue was busier than ever. More workers sought guidance. More families asked for help navigating wage disputes or safety violations. We added 2 new volunteers, then a part-time legal consultant. Every morning I unlocked the front door and felt the small but steady reassurance of purpose. People showed up. They trusted us. They trusted me. Integrity had its own gravity, and for the first time, I let myself feel the weight of that pride. Miles continued working in both worlds, repairing HVAC systems for clients who valued his honesty, while quietly contributing legal expertise when it mattered. He never mentioned the wedding unless I brought it up. He never tried to interpret my emotions for me. He just created enough space for me to breathe without feeling observed. Some nights he cooked dinner before I came home. Other nights we ordered takeout and ate on the couch while discussing long-term plans for expanding the nonprofit. The ordinary rhythm of those evenings became a kind of healing I had never expected. My mom visited for coffee one Saturday morning. She sat across from me at our kitchen table, holding her mug with both hands as if absorbing warmth from it. Her hair was slightly grayer, her voice is softer, but her eyes were clearer than I had seen in years. She said she had begun attending a small community group for women who wanted to rebuild confidence after long marriages shaped by imbalance. She said she was learning how to speak without apologizing for having an opinion. She said she was practicing telling the truth out loud, even when her voice shook. I listened. I let her talk. I did not push her toward any resolution. She was finally taking steps without being directed. That was enough. When she asked whether she had lost the right to be in my life, I told her no. I told her presence and silence are two different forms of participation. She nodded slowly, absorbing the distinction. Before she left, she touched my arm lightly and said she was proud of me. There was no tremor in her voice. It sounded like a sentence she had been practicing privately until she believed it. As for my dad, he did not call. He did not write. He did not attempt a reconciliation. Not once. The absence should have stung. Instead, it landed with an odd kind of clarity. People often reveal their true selves not in crisis, but in the aftermath. His silence did not retreat. It was a refusal. Refusal to engage on terms he could not control. Refusal to inhabit any dynamic where he was not the center of gravity. Whatever life he lived now existed parallel to mine, with no crossing point. I did not check on him. I did not ask my mom for updates. I did not track his name in the business pages anymore. Letting go is an action. I performed it quietly, repeatedly, until it became instinct. One afternoon in April, I walked through a hardware store with Miles while he picked up parts for a repair job. A man in the aisle glanced at us and asked if we were the couple from that wedding. He said he had heard fragments from a friend's cousin who worked with someone who had been there. He said he admired the strength it must have taken to stand up in front of everyone. I felt a faint tightening in my chest, a familiar urge to deflect or minimize, but I did not. I simply said thank you. The moment was brief, a flicker, but it marked something I had not noticed before. The story no longer felt like an open wound. It felt like something I had learned from and walked beyond. Walking beyond does not mean forgetting. It means choosing which part of the story belongs to you. A few weeks later, one of our nonprofit clients brought us a small basket of oranges from his garden. He said he wanted to thank us for standing by him through a difficult year. He said he hoped our lives were blessed in the same way we had blessed his. I stood there holding the basket, feeling the warmth of the fruit through the woven handle, realizing that life had a way of circling back with gentler offerings after seasons of rupture. Late one evening, Miles and I sat on our back porch, wrapped in light jackets, listening to the faint hum of traffic drifting down from Greenwood Avenue. He asked me whether I ever missed the version of family I once imagined. I thought about the photographs still tucked away in a drawer. I thought about the echoes of laughter from memories that no longer fit. I thought about the little girl who tried so hard to be agreeable enough for a man whose approval was always conditional. I told him I did not miss the family I had lost. I missed the family I had hoped for. They are not the same thing. In the quiet that followed, I felt something shift inside me. Not closure. Closure is too neat a word. Something more like acceptance. Acceptance that loss and freedom often arrive together. Acceptance that choosing your own life sometimes means letting go of the people who shaped your earliest understanding of love. Acceptance that boundaries are not punishment but protection. What surprised me most was how simple the truth felt at the end. I had not destroyed anything. I had not betrayed anyone. I had refused to shrink myself to fit a story that was never mine to live. The last time my dad had spoken to me, he told me I was a disappointment. The last time I looked into his eyes, he saw only defiance. Maybe that is his story to keep. It is not mine anymore. My life now is shaped by the things I chose rather than the things chosen for me. Work that matters, love that is steady. A marriage built on partnership instead of performance. A mother attempting, slowly and imperfectly, to relearn herself. A future that does not require my silence as payment. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the moment at the microphone when I told my dad we were no longer family. I used to replay it with a kind of disbelief. Now I replay it with gratitude. Not because it was easy, but because it was true. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.